Welcome back to the channel and to the final major hurdle in this Volkswagen diesel engine swap in our 1989 Chevy S-10 pickup. So, unlike our other silly engine swaps that we've done in the past with pretty much lawnmower engines, this Volkswagen diesel engine swap is meant to be somewhat practical, and this truck is going to get used on camera and off camera. The goal is to build a simple, fuel-efficient, light-duty, compact pickup truck. Now, that's something that just isn't available here in the United States anymore. Well, brand new. Anyway, when we do our engine swaps, we don't hack something together that'll last 1 or 2 videos on YouTube. Nope, we actually build stuff to last. And once it's built, we learn a few things and try to improve on our creations. Today, we're going to tackle the last major bit of fabrication to get this 1.6-liter Volkswagen diesel engine to fit in the chassis of the S10 pickup. Our focus is going to be on modifying the stock Volkswagen oil pan to clear the chassis crossmember that's directly under the engine. Now, to modify the oil pan, well, the engine's definitely going to have to come out of the truck, and that way we can easily work on the bottom side of the engine. That's no big deal. This engine's been in and out of the truck at least 10 times in the last couple of weeks. But before we haul the engine out, I want to tackle one more quick and easy modification, and basically, we need a way to connect the Chevy throttle cable to the Volkswagen injector pump. So this is the throttle on the Volkswagen injector pump, and we need to connect this to the Chevy throttle cable, which is 100% not going to connect to the Volkswagen injector pump. But I have a simple and low-cost solution. So on the bench, I have the Volkswagen injector pump. Now on an old school diesel engine like this one, the throttle is right here on the pump. And moving the throttle is what commands the pump to inject more fuel into the engine. As most of you folks know, there's no carburetor or throttle body on a diesel engine. Anyway, right here is a nub where the Volkswagen throttle cable attaches. And this is the throttle cable that actually came with the Volkswagen engine. It fits sort of like this. So there's a few problems with this setup. First of all, this cable's been cut and for the most part it's no good. So instead of buying another Volkswagen throttle cable that won't fit the Chevy S-10, I have a better solution. I picked up this universal throttle cable from Amazon for 17 bucks. Now, this cable by itself won't work, but it has a few parts on it that we can use to modify the Chevy throttle cable to directly attach to the Volkswagen injector pump. You see, the most important part that we need is attached to this cable with a tiny set screw, and all we need to do is unscrew it and we have the parts we need without putting in too much effort. So from this cable, we're going to be harvesting a few parts. This aluminum cable guide, it'll attach to the throttle bracket right over here. So that takes care of that. So this guy is held onto the throttle arm with a nut, and all we have to do is unscrew the nut to remove this thing. This is as easy as it gets. And now we can install the new part onto the throttle arm and tighten the nut. At this point, we can put the pump back on the engine and modify the length of the Chevy throttle cable. So the pump is loosely sitting in the right position, and now I can mark the Chevy throttle cable to where I want to cut it, and right about here should be good enough. Alright, on this end of the cable, I want to cut this nub off because we don't need it anymore. Now, from the inside of the truck, I pulled the inner cable back about 10 inches. Now I can cut the outer portion of the throttle cable in the area I marked earlier. This is a bit tough to do. Next, I feed the cable through the aluminum cable holder. And then I can snip the cable to the right length and tighten the set screw. And there you have it, a quick and easy mod to mate the Chevy throttle cable to the Volkswagen injector pump. Now, throttle cables for this, that, and the other thing can take a fair bit of engineering and fabrication. I put a link in the video description for this cable because it can be harvested for a lot of hard to find parts. And the cable itself is, it's fine, but if you need a cable end with a set screw and this thingy, well, this is something you might consider just for the parts in your future project. Anyway, playtime's over and now I have to yank the engine out of the truck so we can deal with the oil pan. And it's out. You know, I make stuff look so easy. Alright, we got the engine on the stand and obviously it's flipped upside down. So this is our hacked up oil pan and we know this will fit the chassis of the S10 without modifying the crossmember. Now, of course, modifying the cross member is always an option, but keep in mind, you'd have to cut almost 3/4 of the way or 75% through the cross member in order to provide enough clearance to fit this engine in the truck. Now, that may seem crazy since the Iron Duke fit the chassis no problem. However, this engine is built different than the Iron Duke that previously was in this truck, and the block on this engine has a much longer skirt, and the skirt dips well below the center line of the crankshaft. So that's why this engine doesn't fit like you would expect it to. On the Iron Duke, the skirt on the block drops to the center line of the crankshaft, so the oil pan on the Duke fits higher up on the block than the oil pan on the Volkswagen engine. The difference in how far down the skirt is on the Volkswagen engine versus the Iron Duke is exactly why the Volkswagen engine takes up a lot more space. Unfortunately, mounting the engine higher in the chassis will cause an interference problem with the firewall and a few other things. So I do get comments from the "why didn't you do this or that" folks, and I appreciate the comments. But you can't just look at one issue and solve it without causing a problem with other stuff. Everything takes up space, and solving one problem creates another problem. Ultimately, there has to be a compromise in order to get everything to fit, and in this case, the compromise is the oil pan. Since we're going to have to cut and weld something, why not just cut up the oil pan and leave the chassis alone? At least that's my plan. Anyway, right here you can see where the oil pan was cut and welded, and that's so we could take the ridge out of the bottom of the pan to clear this part of the cross member. Now, this part of the pan was completely cut away to clear this part of the cross member. So it should be noted that at this point, this oil pan is pretty much junk, and we're only using this to work out the details so we can make the exact modifications on a fresh oil pan. So we're going to have to do another cut here and lay this part of the pan down to match this part. Now, this area here is critical because it sets how low the modified pipe from the oil pump pickup can go in order to flip the direction of the pickup so the oil pump can feed from oil in the rear of the engine. Yeah, it gets complicated to explain, but actually it's really easy. Anyway, the rear section of this pan is going to get hacked out so we can build a new oil pump pickup, and right now, the less metal we have in this area is going to help us see what's going on. So let's hack this pan up and I can show you what I have planned. Okay, that should be enough cutting in order to work out a few things. Now, of course, I'll wash out this pan to get all the cutting grit cleaned away before we can fit it on the engine to see what's going on. So here we are again with the pan on the engine. This time we have a large window on the back side of the pan. This should give us plenty of space to work with. So the oil pump pickup attaches to the oil pump here, and with the pickup installed, the engine will feed on oil about midpoint in the engine. The problem is, this area ends up being in the section of the pan that gets severely cut away, and there's no longer any room for the pickup. So the plan is to modify the pickup so it feeds on oil at the rear of the engine. So in order to flip the direction of the pickup, we're going to splice in this section from a Chevy oil pump pickup to the Volkswagen pickup in order to get things going in the right direction. This Chevy part is actually almost the perfect fit, but it doesn't go deep enough. We're going to use the Volkswagen flange that fits onto the pump perfectly. Then we're going to graft on the Chevy pipe that makes a 180-degree turn, and then we're going to splice on the Volkswagen strainer. Now in this case, we have to use the Volkswagen strainer because the Chevy strainer is going to be a bit too big. It'll all make sense soon. Anyway, splicing something like this takes a lot of talent, and I don't have that at the moment. So I headed over to King's Precision Machining in Hutchinson, Kansas. Aaron, the owner of the business, is actually a big fan of the channel, and he was able to precision TIG weld my parts together. I'm no welding expert, and I believe TIG welding is the only way to join these parts together. Of course, all the parts were deburred and cleaned prior to welding to ensure a perfect weld. TIG welding takes skill and equipment that I don't have, so it kind of feels like cheating when I have someone else do stuff. But in this case, it was definitely necessary. Fast forward a bit and I'm back at the shop, and now I can test fit the part so I can work out the shape of the rest of the oil pan. I have to say, this contraption came out really nice, and I'm so happy I didn't try to MIG weld this myself. That would have been a disaster for sure. You know, it's best to have a professional do some stuff, I reckon. Anyway, let's see how this fits. The bolts that I'm using to test fit this part are just temporary, and I don't plan on using these on the final assembly. Now I can slip the oil pan on and we can see how this all fits together. Not too shabby. Now of course the rear of the oil pan will need to be deeper, and that was the plan all along in order to make up for the lost volume from the other oil pan modifications. Now here's something to consider. When this engine was in the Volkswagen, it was on a 15-degree slant. However, when we mounted it in the truck, we eliminated the slant and the engine stands straight up. Now, standing this engine straight up actually increases the oil capacity by almost a quart. Standing the engine straight up is actually not a problem, and it's done all the time on various engine swaps. The oil will drain from the top of the engine to the pan exactly the same, so no worries. Anyway, we do pick up some oil capacity in the way we place the engine in the truck, and we lose some capacity in the way we reshape the pan. So we have to add a deeper sump, and that should bring our capacity back to normal or close to it. Sometimes it's easy for folks to lose focus on what we're actually building, and this is not going to be a high-performance road racer. In fact, the acceleration is likely going to be a bit disappointing. I mean, that's kind of obvious. There's no reason to tell me that, right? I think at this point, we have enough data to fabricate a new oil pan, so let's start off with a fresh pan. Now, this pan has a very light coat of silver paint, and that's so I can mark out my cut lines with a decent amount of contrast. So the first cut line I want to mark is how far down I need to cut this pan, which is, I don't know. But these chunks of aluminum and a piece of angle iron is about the right distance. With a Sharpie, I can then draw a precision cut line around the oil pan like so. So far, so good. Now, for the rest of the cut lines, I actually have to sort of measure stuff yeah. Fast forward a little bit, and I figured out where I need to make my cuts and whatnot. Now, this oil pan has a lot of bumps and doohickeys that'll need to be hammered flat, plus it's going to need a handful of pie cuts and welds just to get it in some sort of shape where I can then modify it. So let's get started with the angle grinder and see where that leads us. Okay, the oil pan is taking shape. Now, it may be hard to tell, but the sump area has been transformed into a clean opening that I can build on. I don't have a lot of experience with this sort of sheet metal fabrication, and this was actually a lot of work. I'm trying to keep this simple because that's the limit of my abilities. So yeah, it fits, and now we need to fabricate some sort of sump. So for the sump and a few other things I need to make, I'll be using 16 gauge hot rolled steel, a hammer, a vise, an angle grinder, and a welder. That's pretty much it for the tools that I have, but it should be enough to get the job done. Fast forward a few hours and we have a bizarre looking oil pan that'll definitely fit the truck. So the capacity that we lose from this area is made up by this thingy, and this is the cap and the new drain location. Now this thing is tack welded together in a few places and it's far from finished, but you get the idea what it's going to look like. On the back side, I probably could have extended the sump another inch or so, but at that point it starts getting a lot more complicated. For now, this should be good enough. Now, welding this up, I don't trust my welds. So I'm going to cheat and have Aaron over at King's Precision Machining do it for me. The good news is, this is the last major custom part we need in order to fit the Volkswagen engine into the Chevy S-10. Everything else will either be stock Volkswagen parts or stock Chevy parts or a combination of both. So the oil pan was dropped off at the welder and I'm waiting for the phone call to come pick it up. Now that'll give me time to work on other details on the truck. As you can see, the doors are back on now and I'm in the process of reassembling basically the whole truck. Of course, the front clip can't be put back on until the engine's back in position. Now I still have a few other items on the list, like modifying the fuel tank to eliminate the fuel pump, and in theory, the Volkswagen engine doesn't need a lift pump for the fuel. However, we will be installing an external lift pump rated for diesel fuel because it's nice to have something like that when changing the fuel filters down the road. There's nothing worse than trying to start a diesel engine with a dry fuel system. Anyway, stay tuned, we're getting real close to wrapping up this engine swap. So last week I shared a side project that my cameraman Eric is doing with his son. Eric was able to buy this 1988 Camaro IROC-Z with a 350 and a manual transmission for pretty much nothing. However, he also got no information on the car other than it has a clear title. Tragically, the previous owner had passed away while he was in the process of doing something to this car, and unfortunately we don't know why this car was partially disassembled. Now under the hood, a rodent had made a massive mess, and as you can see, the sticks and stuff had covered the engine and it wasn't clear what was really under all this debris. So this car actually does have a factory installed 5.7 liter engine, and it also has a manual transmission. Now the manual transmission is a subject for debate because officially these cars were never offered with a 5-speed. However, if you dig deep enough on the internet, you can find examples of these cars with factory installed 350s and a 5-speed. These special order cars are extremely rare, and some of them were built for GM executives, so they do exist. Now, the only way to know for sure if this is a factory 5-speed is if I can find the RPO codes. Unfortunately, the RPO code sticker is often attached to the lid on the center console, and on this car, the original center console was replaced with a Gen 4 console, which happens to be from a car with a 6-speed transmission. So this car has a 6-speed shift knob, however, the actual shift pattern is a 5-speed that's typical of a T5 transmission. Well, fast forward a few days and it's not looking too good. After a fair bit of digging, we discovered that the intake manifold was removed prior to the car being pushed out into the yard. And as you can see, the debris pretty much has filled the lifter gallery. So that means moisture, urine, and feces and other things have gotten into the engine. You know, you can't kill a Chevy engine, so I'm told, but this may be a bit much. Now, after digging a little bit more, it's clear that the engine's going to have to come out for further inspection. You know, this ain't the sort of car you want to do a hillbilly resurrection on, although it probably could be done. Now, in the back of the car, we found a bunch of manifolds, and there's a stock TPI setup and an LT1 manifold, possibly from a Corvette. So as you can see on the LT1 manifold, it's been modified by having some of the ports welded shut. Very interesting. So which manifold was actually on the car the last time it was running, you might ask? Well, it turns out that this bracket for the throttle cable will only fit the stock TPI plenum. So with a high degree of probability, the LT1 manifold was never on this car, and this small block was likely breathing through the stock TPI manifold. Perhaps the previous owner was in the process of an upgrade of some sort? Sadly, we'll never know. So we do have a few more clues to go over. Over on this side of the engine, we can see that it's been fitted with crane cam rocker arms. So someone's definitely been in here, and given that the engine's the wrong color for this year of car, the engine's most likely been out of the car at one point. There's a good chance that there's a hotter camshaft in this engine, amongst other things. It also appears this engine's been fitted with a set of decent quality Edelbrock headers. So again, interesting, we definitely have a mystery here. The rest of the car appears stock, and no effort has been made to lighten the car of any sort, and this is kind of a heavy car. Now the last clue that I have for you is, well, we found a time slip under the seat. This slip is hard to see on camera, so let me put a scan of it up on the screen. This time slip is for both the right and left lanes at a drag strip, and there's no indication which lane this car was in. Anyway, in the left lane we have a 13.17 second ET, and in the right lane we have a 17.33 second ET. So we really don't know what lane this car was in. However, on the windshield, there's a sticker indicating this car belongs to the 100 mile per hour club. So that's another clue. So what we know so far is this car had a stock intake manifold with some bolt-on parts and possibly a hotter cam. Well, 17 seconds is way too slow for this car, and 13 seconds would be impressive for something like this. I don't know. What do you guys think? Is this a 13-second car? You figure with the driver, this thing would tip the scales at 35 to 3,600 pounds, so that would mean the engine was making over 300 horsepower, which is definitely possible. Now, back to the engine. If the previous owner was in the process of swapping over to the LT1 manifold, which is just pure speculation, why did he remove the rocker arms and push rods on the right side of the engine? Assuming the person knew what it was doing, there's absolutely no reason to remove the rockers and the push rods for a manifold swap. Unless he was also going to change the heads, possibly go with something more aluminum and less cast iron? I think that's possible. Or since this car's been off the road since 2016, there may be something else wrong with the engine, perhaps a blown head gasket, or who knows. Unfortunately, at this point, the engine definitely has to come out because there's way too many unanswered questions and there's too much crap in the engine. Now, since the engine has to come out, is it time to do an LS swap? Well, speak of the devil. This gem belongs to my neighbor Nick and it has a very tidy LS tucked under its hood. Ah, I love that sound. This Camaro is not my car, and at this point, I have no idea what Eric's going to be doing with it. I'll definitely keep you folks updated as this project evolves. Well, that's all I have for today, and next time we'll be putting the diesel engine back in the S10 pickup and getting it ready to run and drive. So, I hope you'll come back for more shenanigans. Until next time.